The fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps as I stood frozen by the industrial coffee dispenser, watching my career bleed out in real time. The bitter aroma of burnt coffee mixed with the metallic taste of betrayal coating my tongue. Marcus Blackwood, the silver spoon psychopath who'd inherited his daddy's empire, slithered into the break room like a venomous snake hunting prey, his $1,000 suit unable to disguise the rotting core underneath. No pleasantries. No human decency. No acknowledgement of the 11 years I'd spent building his kingdom brick by bloody brick. Just those dead, predatory eyes scanning me like I was roadkill he needed to scrape off his Italian leather shoes. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap and slice through everything I'd worked for. "Valentina," he hissed, voice dripping with manufactured authority that fooled nobody except himself. "My office." Now. It wasn't a request. It was an execution order delivered by a man who'd never earned the right to issue commands. His voice carried the entitled poison of someone who'd been handed power on a silver platter, never understanding the weight of what he held. 11 years. 11 fucking years I'd bled for Blackwood Industries. I'd crawled through trenches of impossible deadlines, survived corporate wars that would have destroyed lesser souls, and built their client division from the ground up with nothing but raw determination and sleepless nights. I'd clawed through over 100 brutal negotiations, each one a battle against competitors who wanted to see us burn. I'd trained every single soldier who now sat trembling outside his glass fortress, watching their mentor march toward slaughter. But none of that mattered to this trust fund parasite. My achievements were invisible to him. My value reduced to a line item he could cross out with a flourish of his gold-plated pen. The corridor that had once felt like my domain now stretched before me like a death march, each step echoing with the ghosts of victories he'd never understand. I followed him through corridors I'd walked as a warrior, now marching toward my execution. The familiar faces of my colleagues blurred past, some avoiding eye contact, others wearing expressions of confused concern. They could smell the blood in the water, sense the corporate assassination about to unfold. But they were powerless to stop it, trapped in their cubicles like witnesses to a public hanging. Marcus's office was a monument to inherited arrogance. Awards he'd never earned lining the walls, photos with clients I'd secured and maintained displayed like trophies of his non-existent victories. The irony was suffocating. He sat behind a desk that might as well have been a throne, surrounded by the fruits of my labor, while preparing to discard me like yesterday's newspaper. He didn't even have the decency to sit down for my professional murder, standing there like some twisted judge delivering a verdict in a kangaroo court. Marcus shuffled papers like he was ordering takeout instead of destroying a human being's livelihood. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. This wasn't just termination, it was desecration. "You're terminated," he snarled, his words hitting like shrapnel from an exploding grenade. "We don't need dead weight poisoning this company. You're lazy, incompetent, and frankly, we should have gotten rid of you years ago." The accusation was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that for a moment I wondered if I was hallucinating. Dead weight? The woman who'd single-handedly saved 3 major accounts from jumping ship to competitors? Lazy? The person who'd worked through holidays, missed family gatherings, and sacrificed pieces of her soul to keep this company profitable? The words hit like a sledgehammer to the skull, each syllable designed to shatter not just my employment but my self-worth. My vision tunneled, the edges of reality blurring as rage and shock battled for control of my nervous system. My pulse hammered against my temples like war drums, blood rushing so fast I could hear it roaring in my ears. But in that moment of absolute devastation, something crystallized inside me. A cold, calculating fury that burned hotter than any fire. This spoiled child thought he could humiliate me, destroy me with lies and manufactured justifications. He expected tears, begging, the collapse of everything I'd built my identity around. Instead, I smiled. A razor-sharp, ice-cold smile that could cut through steel and freeze hell itself. The expression that crossed my face was the same one a predator wears when it realizes the prey has just made a fatal mistake. "Understood," I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's blade, each word precisely calibrated to hide the nuclear explosion happening inside my chest. "Have a delightful day, Marcus." The dismissal was perfect. polite enough to deny him the satisfaction of a reaction, cold enough to let him know that his words had bounced off armor he couldn't see. I watched confusion flicker across his entitled features as he tried to process why his victim wasn't groveling. I walked out with my spine straight and my head high, every step a testament to a dignity he could never touch. But inside, a hurricane was tearing me apart, ripping through memories of late nights and early mornings, of deals saved and crises averted, of a career built on competence and destroyed by incompetence. My team's faces blurred past as I moved through the office like a ghost, confused, concerned, ready to fight for me if I gave them the signal. Sarah from accounting half rose from her chair, her mouth opening to form words of support or outrage. Marcus from marketing looked like he'd been punched in the gut, his loyalty to me written all over his stricken face. But I shook my head, a subtle movement that said everything. Don't make this bloodbath worse. Don't let him turn this into a scene that gives him more power. The packing process was surgical in its efficiency. 11 years of professional life reduced to a cardboard box. Photos of successful negotiations. Awards for excellence that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Personal items that had made this hostile environment feel like home. Each item I placed in that box was another piece of my identity being erased. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and radio noise, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The familiar route from office to apartment had transformed into a journey between two different versions of myself. The successful executive I'd been that morning, and the unemployed casualty I'd become by lunch. That night, sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. The questions circled my mind like vultures. Why now? Why me? Why with such brutal suddenness? Something about Marcus's arrogant dismissal felt wrong, like a chess move made by someone who'd never learned the rules, but was convinced of his own brilliance. I replayed every interaction, every meeting, every project from the past months, searching for clues I might have missed. Had I threatened him somehow? Had my competence made his incompetence too obvious? Was this about the upcoming Sovereign Industries deal? The $50 million contract that would either cement our company's reputation or destroy it completely. The timing was devastating. We were 48 hours from closing the Sovereign Industries deal, a negotiation I'd spent 6 months orchestrating like a military campaign. Every detail had been mapped out, every contingency planned for, every potential objection anticipated and countered. The client trusted me specifically, had worked with me through dozens of smaller contracts to build up to this moment. And now I was gone, vanished like smoke, leaving behind a power vacuum that Marcus's inflated ego couldn't possibly fill. The thought should have given me satisfaction, but instead it filled me with professional horror. Good people would suffer for his stupidity. The company I'd helped build would pay the price for one man's reckless arrogance. But Marcus had made one fatal miscalculation, and as the hours passed, that mistake began to reveal itself like a slow-motion explosion. At 9:07 a.m., my phone exploded with fury. The caller ID showed a number I knew by heart. Harrison Blackwood. The real titan who'd built this empire with blood and steel, sweat and sacrifice. His voice cracked through the speaker like thunder rolling across a battlefield, carrying 30 years of earned authority that his son would never possess. Valentina, what the hell happened? I just walked into the office and found your desk cleaned out. Why did you abandon ship? Why now, when we're so close to the Sovereign deal? The pain in his voice was genuine. This wasn't corporate theater or political maneuvering. This was a man who genuinely respected my work, who'd watched me grow from an ambitious newcomer into an irreplaceable asset, discovering that his own son had just committed professional suicide. My throat tightened as I explained the morning's events, each detail landing like a physical blow on the man who'd given me my first real chance in this industry. The silence that followed my explanation stretched so long I wondered if the connection had died. He said what? Harrison's voice had dropped to a whisper, the kind of quiet that precedes volcanic eruptions. He called you lazy? Incompetent? Jesus Christ, Valentina, you've saved more deals than anyone in this company's history. You've been working 16-hour days for months. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in corporate warfare. Harrison's voice went from confusion to horror to apocalyptic rage, as the full scope of his son's kamikaze mission became clear. I could hear papers rustling, objects being moved, probably thrown, as he processed the magnitude of the disaster. "Valentina," he said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. "Your contract. The sovereign deal. Tell me Marcus read your contract before firing you." "I doubt it," I replied, though a sick feeling was building in my stomach. He seemed to think he could just dismiss me and move on. "Jesus Christ," Harrison whispered, and I could hear papers erupting across his office like a document storm. "Valentina, you're not just the account manager for Sovereign Industries. You're the only authorized negotiator. The contract specifically names you as the sole representative empowered to finalize terms. Marcus can't close it without you. Nobody can." The realization hit like lightning striking a powder keg. The clause had been Harrison's idea after a previous acquisition disaster where multiple people claimed authority to negotiate, creating confusion that nearly lost a major deal. He'd insisted that for deals over a certain threshold, one person would be designated as the exclusive negotiator to prevent mixed messages and conflicting terms. Marcus hadn't just fired an employee. He'd assassinated the company's biggest deal. He'd pulled the pin on a grenade and forgotten he was still holding it. In his rush to demonstrate power, he'd destroyed the very thing that would have proven his worth as a leader. "The meeting is scheduled for 11 this morning," Harrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of impending doom. "The Sovereign team is flying in from Dubai specifically for this. If we can't close today, they're walking. They've made that crystal clear." The magnitude of Marcus's mistake was breathtaking. Sovereign Industries wasn't just any client. They were a gateway to the entire Middle Eastern market, a relationship I'd spent years cultivating through careful attention to cultural details, language preferences, and business customs that most Western companies ignored. The CEO, Alastair Reeves, had specifically requested to work with me after our initial meeting, impressed by my preparation and understanding of their operational requirements. "I need you to come back," Harrison said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "Not just for the deal, but so we can fix this mess my son created." After Harrison hung up, I sat motionless in my apartment, coffee growing cold beside me while I stared at nothing in particular. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional buzz of my phone as news of the crisis spread through the company's communication networks. He didn't know. Harrison hadn't known his son had fired me without even reading the contract, without understanding the legal and practical implications, without considering the carefully constructed relationships that made deals possible. Marcus had acted on impulse and arrogance, confident that his authority could overcome any obstacle. I leaned back on the couch and let out a quiet, bitter laugh that held no humor, only the sharp edge of irony cutting through my exhaustion. After 11 years, this was how it ended. Brought down by a spoiled, impulsive manchild trying to play CEO, making decisions like they were moves in a video game where you could always restart after a bad call. But real companies don't respawn after fatal errors, and this one was about to find that out the hard way. By 10:15 a.m., my phone was a battlefield. Marcus called once, his voice already showing cracks in its earlier confidence. When I didn't answer, he called again. Then the entire company began hemorrhaging panic. Reception, legal, accounting, even the janitor. Everyone scrambling like rats fleeing a sinking ship as news of the Sovereign Industries catastrophe spread through the building. I watched it all burn from my apartment, sipping coffee that had gone cold hours ago, feeling like a general observing a battle from a distant hill. Each missed call was another degree of desperation, another crack in the facade of corporate control that Marcus had tried to project. The voicemail he left was pathetic in its transparent panic. "Valentina, listen, there was a misunderstanding yesterday. I might have acted too hastily. We need you back today. It's urgent. Please call me back immediately." Urgent. The word tasted like blood in the water. No apology for the humiliation he'd inflicted. No acknowledgement of his devastating incompetence, or the lies he'd used to justify my termination. Just desperation wearing a suit, trying to undo a mistake he was only beginning to understand. At 10:45, my former colleague Isabel called, her voice trembling with barely contained excitement and horror. Isabel was one of the few people in the company who understood the full scope of what I did, having worked closely with me on several major accounts before transferring to marketing. "Valentina, you won't believe the massacre happening here," she whispered, clearly calling from a bathroom or supply closet to avoid being overheard. "Harrison just eviscerated Marcus in front of the entire executive team. I mean, completely destroyed him. The boardroom looked like a crime scene." She described Harrison storming into the morning meeting, his face the color of nuclear winter, carrying a folder thick with documents. He'd slammed the Sovereign Industries contract on the conference table like a judge's gavel, the sound echoing through the glass-walled room and silencing every conversation. "He asked one question," Isabel continued, her voice filled with awe at the display of paternal fury. "Did you read this contract before destroying our negotiator?" Just that. Nothing else. And Marcus tried to bluff, started talking about moving in new directions and reevaluating personnel, but Harrison wasn't having it. I could picture the scene. Marcus's practiced corporate speak crumbling under the weight of actual consequences, his confidence evaporating like morning mist as reality crashed down around him. Harrison flipped to the negotiation clause. Isabel continued. "The one that specifically names you as the exclusive representative." He read it out loud, word for word, while Marcus sat there turning the color of ash. You could watch his face change as he realized what he'd done. She described Marcus's transformation from arrogant executive to condemned man, his usual swagger replaced by the desperate scrambling of someone who'd just realized they were drowning in their own mistakes. Harrison told him, and I quote, "If the Sovereign deal dies because of your incompetence, so does your position here. Permanently." Then he walked out, leaving Marcus sitting there like a ghost haunting his own funeral. The image was almost enough to make me feel sympathy for Marcus. Almost. But then I remembered his smug expression as he'd called me lazy and incompetent, his casual cruelty in destroying not just my job, but attempting to destroy my professional reputation. The rest of the morning was a masterclass in corporate panic management. My phone continued its desperate symphony. Legal calling to discuss contract implications, accounting trying to understand the financial exposure, even HR attempting damage control. Each call was a testament to how thoroughly Marcus had miscalculated, how completely he'd failed to understand the intricate machinery of the business he'd inherited. I answered none of them. Instead, I sat in my apartment, watching the city move on with its indifferent rhythm while a corporate empire crumbled in the background. There was something almost meditative about the chaos I wasn't participating in, the crisis I was watching from a safe distance. But even as I enjoyed Marcus's comeuppance, I couldn't stop thinking about the good people who would suffer for his mistakes. The junior employees who'd worked on the Sovereign proposal, the administrative staff who'd coordinated meetings and travel, the entire support network that had made the deal possible. They didn't deserve to have their hard work destroyed by one man's ego. When Harrison called again at 1:30 p.m., I finally answered. "Valentina," he said. And his voice carried the weight of someone who'd just watched his legacy nearly destroyed by his own flesh and blood. "I'm sitting in the boardroom where we were supposed to close the biggest deal in company history. The Sovereign team is on their way to the airport. They gave us until 3 o'clock to produce an authorized negotiator, or they're walking away forever." The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking. Harrison Blackwood was a legend in our industry. A man who'd built a multinational corporation from nothing, who'd survived recessions and buyout attempts and every challenge the business world could throw at him. But his own son had nearly destroyed everything in a single moment of spite. "I need you to come back," he said simply. "Not just for the company, but because you're the only one who can save what we've all worked to build." The drive back to Blackwood Industries felt like returning from exile. The familiar route took on new significance, every turn a choice between revenge and redemption, between letting Marcus burn in the fire he'd started, or helping to preserve something larger than our personal conflict. When I finally returned to Blackwood Industries, I made a calculated decision about how to make my entrance. I didn't slink through the employee entrance like a wounded animal returning to its cage. Instead, I strode through the main lobby like a conquering general returning from war, my heels clicking against marble floors with the rhythm of an approaching storm. The entire building held its breath as I walked through corridors that had witnessed my humiliation just 24 hours earlier. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Keyboards fell silent as everyone processed the impossible sight of my return. The receptionist, a sweet girl named Amanda who'd always greeted me warmly, stood up so fast she nearly knocked over her chair. "Miss Valentina," we thought. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you in his office." The atmosphere was electric with tension and curiosity. Word had spread about Marcus's catastrophic mistake, about the sovereign industry's crisis, about the possibility that the company's future hung in the balance of whatever happened next. Harrison was waiting at his office door when I arrived, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. No smiles, no pleasantries, no corporate theater, just the weary respect of one warrior acknowledging another after a brutal campaign. "Valentina," he said, nodding with the gravity of someone conducting a funeral. "Thank you for coming back." His office felt different than it had during our previous meetings, smaller somehow, weighted down by the magnitude of what his son had nearly destroyed. The awards and photos that usually seemed impressive now looked fragile, like monuments to an empire that had almost crumbled in a single day. "I made a catastrophic error," Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of empires built and nearly lost. "I gave that boy a loaded weapon before teaching him not to shoot himself. I wanted him to prove himself capable of leadership, but I didn't expect him to burn bridges before even learning how to build them." The admission was stunning in its honesty. Harrison Blackwood didn't apologize easily or often. His success had come from decisive action and unwavering confidence. But here he was, acknowledging that his faith in his son had nearly destroyed everything he'd worked to build. "What Marcus did to you was unprofessional, disrespectful, and frankly, it jeopardized not just a deal but the integrity of everything we've built here," he continued, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that demanded honesty in return. "But this wasn't just about contracts or corporate politics. This was about respect, about dignity, about the years I'd sacrificed while incompetent princes played king with other people's livelihoods. It was about the principle that competence should matter more than lineage, that results should outweigh relationships." "I'll return," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade forged in the fire of the previous day's humiliation. "But I want everything in writing. Full autonomy over the sovereign deal. A revised contract that protects me from future misunderstandings, and Marcus never interferes with my work again." "Done," Harrison said without hesitation, his relief so palpable it was almost embarrassing. "Whatever you need, however you want to structure it, just tell me what it takes to make this right." The Sovereign Industries meeting was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. Just enough time to review the contract terms one final time, and prepare for what would either be the most important negotiation of my career, or a disaster that would haunt me forever. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was racing to save a deal for the same company that had fired me for being lazy and incompetent, less than 24 hours earlier. The boardroom had been prepared like an operating theater. Documents precisely arranged, water glasses filled, technology tested and retested. But there was an underlying tension that couldn't be hidden by professional preparation. Everyone knew how close we'd come to losing everything, how narrowly we'd avoided a catastrophe that would have rippled through every department. As I reviewed the contract one final time, I caught sight of Marcus through the glass walls of the meeting room. He was pacing in the corridor like a caged animal, his usual confident stride replaced by the jerky movements of someone fighting panic. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his expression: fear. Not the healthy fear of professional consequences, but the raw terror of someone who'd just realized they were in over their head, that their actions had consequences they'd never imagined. For the first time since his brutal dismissal, I felt something approaching sympathy for Marcus Blackwood. At 2:30 sharp, Alistair Reeves entered with his team of advisors and legal representatives. Reeves was a man who'd built an empire in one of the world's most challenging business environments, sharp, intuitive, and utterly intolerant of incompetence or disorganization. Any whiff of internal chaos would send him running, and his team was already showing signs of concern about the day's delays and confusion. The greeting was crucial. I stood and addressed him in Arabic, thanking him for his patience and expressing genuine enthusiasm for finalizing our partnership. His face transformed instantly. The practiced wariness of an international businessman replaced by the warm smile of someone who felt genuinely welcomed and respected. "Valentina," he said, his accent giving my name a musical quality. "You remembered our conversation about cultural appreciation in business relationships. This level of attention to detail is exactly why we chose to work with Blackwood Industries." The meeting that followed was a masterclass in negotiation. Every clause discussed, every concern addressed, every detail refined until both parties felt confident in the partnership we were creating. But beneath the professional exterior, I was hyper-aware that this wasn't just a business deal. This was redemption. Proof that competence and preparation could overcome the chaos created by incompetent leadership. 2 hours later, we shook hands on the biggest deal in company history. The Sovereign Industries contract would transform Blackwood Industries from a regional player into an international force, opening doors to markets we'd only dreamed of accessing. As Reeves and his team prepared to leave, he pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Valentina," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen every type of business leader. "In my experience, companies are only as strong as their weakest decision-maker. Today, you've shown me that Blackwood Industries has at least one person who understands that business is built on relationships and trust, not just contracts and profits." The compliment was more valuable than any bonus or promotion. Recognition from someone whose opinion carried weight across multiple industries and continents. But it also served as a subtle warning about the importance of surrounding yourself with competent people. As the Sovereign team left, Marcus finally made his appearance. He'd been lurking outside the boardroom throughout the entire meeting, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone who'd watched their career nearly end in real time. When our eyes met across the corridor, I saw the exact moment he realized that his empire of arrogance had crumbled into dust. He'd fired the queen and tried to play chess with pawns, and only now was he beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. Harrison approached me as the elevator doors closed behind our new partners. His relief so profound it was almost physical. "You saved us," he said simply. "You saved the company, the deal, probably a dozen jobs that would have been lost if Sovereign had walked away." "I saved what we all built together," I replied, because it was true. The Sovereign deal wasn't the work of one person. It was the culmination of years of relationship building, preparation, and professional excellence from multiple departments. But even as we celebrated the successful conclusion of the negotiation, I knew this wasn't over. Marcus might have been humbled by the day's events, but spoiled princes don't surrender. They regroup and plan their revenge. The next few weeks revealed the true extent of Marcus's vindictive nature. Unable to fire me again, he resorted to the kind of corporate sabotage that required patience and subtlety, qualities I wouldn't have credited him with possessing. It started with small things that could be dismissed as administrative errors. Expense reports delayed in processing, forcing me to advance my own money for business travel. Important documents mysteriously misfiled, creating gaps in project timelines. Meeting invitations that somehow never reached my inbox, making me appear unprofessional or disorganized. Then came the digital warfare. Emails appeared to be sent from my account containing incorrect information. Wrong meeting times sent to clients, inaccurate project updates distributed to team members, inappropriate responses to sensitive inquiries that could have damaged years-old relationships. The IT department claimed there was no evidence of external hacking. The messages originated from inside the company network, suggesting that someone with legitimate access was systematically attempting to destroy my professional reputation. I recognized the pattern immediately because I'd seen it before, early in my career when I'd worked under a director who specialized in this type of psychological warfare. He couldn't confront talented subordinates directly. That would have exposed his own inadequacies. So he'd slowly poison their professional environment until they quit in frustration or made mistakes that justified their termination. But I wasn't the naive 20-something I'd been during that first job. I understood corporate warfare now, knew how to document attacks and build cases that would stand up to investigation. Every suspicious email was forwarded to my personal account. Every missed meeting was noted with timestamps and attendee lists. Every administrative error was recorded in a private log that told a story of systematic harassment. The breakthrough came when I overheard a conversation that confirmed my suspicions. I was passing the executive conference room when Marcus's voice carried through the partially open door, his tone carrying the casual cruelty of someone who enjoyed inflicting professional pain. "She's been unstable since she came back," he was saying to someone I couldn't see. "Erratic, aggressive, making mistakes that suggest she's not handling the pressure well. I'm just concerned about her ability to manage high-stakes client relationships going forward." The psychological manipulation was expertly crafted, expressing concern while planting seeds of doubt, positioning himself as a thoughtful leader worried about an employee's well-being while systematically destroying her credibility. "Maybe we should start thinking about succession planning for the client strategy position," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the false sympathy of a predator wearing sheep's clothing. "She pulled off the sovereign deal. I'll give her credit for that. But we can't run a company on isolated successes. We need consistency, stability." Another voice responded, someone I recognized as Trevor Morrison, a newer executive who joined the company after Marcus arrived. "But the sovereign deal was huge. She delivered under incredible pressure." Marcus's laugh was cold and calculated. "She got lucky. We can't base our company's future on luck. Besides, I've been getting reports about communication issues, missed deadlines, problems with interdepartmental cooperation. Nothing dramatic, just a pattern of decline that suggests she's overwhelmed." The systematic nature of his campaign was breathtaking in its malicious efficiency. Every mistake he'd orchestrated was being used as evidence of my supposed incompetence. Every administrative delay was being reframed as a sign of my inability to handle responsibility. That evening, I stayed late in the office, long after the corridors had emptied and the fluorescent lights had dimmed to their nighttime setting. I sat in the glass-walled conference room where I'd saved the sovereign deal, staring at the city lights beyond the windows and wondering how many more battles I'd have to fight just to maintain the right to do my job. The sound of footsteps broke through my contemplation. Harrison appeared at the doorway, his expression carrying the weariness of someone who'd been fighting corporate fires all day. "Still here?" he asked, though the question carried deeper implications. Concern about my mental state, curiosity about why I was working such long hours, perhaps suspicion about whether Marcus's whispered allegations contained any truth. "Just finishing up some reports," I replied, gesturing at the laptop screen that displayed my private documentation of Marcus's sabotage campaign. "Making sure all the details are properly recorded." Harrison stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the documents I'd been reviewing. He was a shrewd businessman who'd survived decades of corporate warfare. He could probably sense the undercurrents of conflict even if he couldn't see the specific details. "Valentina," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd decided to address an elephant in the room. "I want you to know that I've been hearing rumors, concerns about communication issues, administrative problems. I want to give you the chance to address any challenges you might be facing." The conversation was a trap disguised as support. If I denied the problems, I'd appear defensive or oblivious. If I acknowledged them, I'd be confirming Marcus's narrative of decline and incompetence. But I'd been preparing for this moment since the sabotage campaign began. "I appreciate your concern," I said, opening a folder on my laptop that contained months of documentation. "And I think you should see this." For the next 30 minutes, I walked Harrison through the systematic campaign of harassment and sabotage that had been orchestrated against me. Every fake email, every administrative delay, every communication problem was revealed as part of a coordinated effort to destroy my professional reputation. The evidence was overwhelming. Digital forensics showing that the fraudulent emails had been sent from workstations accessible to Marcus's inner circle. Administrative delays that coincided with his presence in relevant departments. Patterns of harassment that followed a clear timeline beginning immediately after his humiliation during the sovereign industries crisis. Harrison's expression darkened as the scope of his son's vindictive campaign became clear. This wasn't just about personal animosity. It was about corporate integrity, about the toxic culture that develops when incompetent leaders are allowed to retaliate against competent subordinates. "I've started an internal audit," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a father's disappointment and a CEO's fury. "Too many irregularities have been surfacing lately. Things that don't make sense, patterns that suggest deliberate manipulation." The admission confirmed what I'd suspected. I wasn't the only target of Marcus's campaign. Other employees had probably suffered similar treatment, their careers damaged or destroyed by a man who confused authority with competence. Why haven't you put a stop to this? I asked, the question carrying months of frustration and professional exhaustion. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights as if they contained answers to impossible questions. Because I needed to see how far he would go, he said finally, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who'd watched their hopes crumble. I kept hoping he would grow into the role, that he would learn from his mistakes and become the leader this company needs. And now? I asked. Now I have to decide whether I'm running a family business or a professional organization, he replied, the words carrying the weight of a legacy that might not survive its next generation. The internal audit that followed was devastating in its thoroughness. Digital forensics experts traced every suspicious email, every administrative irregularity, every pattern of harassment back to its source. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond my personal situation. Marcus had been using his position to settle scores, eliminate threats, and surround himself with incompetent loyalists who wouldn't challenge his authority. The damage to company morale and efficiency was staggering. Talented employees had left quietly rather than fight his vindictive campaigns. Promising projects had failed due to his interference. Client relationships had suffered from the chaos he created. When the audit committee presented their findings to the board of directors, the evidence was so overwhelming that there was no possibility of denial or mitigation. Marcus had committed professional suicide through his own vindictive stupidity, leaving behind a trail of documentation that read like a textbook case in corporate malfeasance. The final confrontation took place in the same boardroom where I'd saved the Sovereign Industries deal. Marcus sat at the conference table like a defendant awaiting sentencing, his earlier arrogance replaced by the desperate calculation of someone trying to find an escape route that didn't exist. Harrison presented the audit findings with clinical precision. Every forged email, every administrative sabotage, every attempt to destroy employee morale documented and traced back to its source. The evidence was presented without emotional commentary, just facts that spoke for themselves about the toxic leadership that had infected the company. Did you think no one would notice? Harrison asked his son, the question carrying 30 years of paternal disappointment. Did you think you could sabotage employees, compromise client relationships, and undermine company operations without consequences? Marcus's response was predictably pathetic. Denials mixed with justifications, attempts to reframe his sabotage as legitimate business decisions, desperate efforts to spread blame to other people. But the evidence was too comprehensive, too detailed, too damning to be dismissed or explained away. I gave you opportunities that most people never receive, Harrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone watching their legacy crumble. I gave you authority, resources, support, and the benefit of every doubt. Instead of using those gifts to build something worthwhile, you used them to tear down the people who were actually building this company. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that his actions had consequences that extended beyond his personal authority. The company he'd inherited was bigger than his ego, more important than his vindictive impulses. Your position here is terminated immediately, Harrison said, the words falling like a judge's gavel in a courtroom. Effective today, you are no longer employed by Blackwood Industries in any capacity. The finality of the statement hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally a hollow acceptance that his corporate kingdom had crumbled around him. He'd played the game of power without understanding the rules, and now he was paying the ultimate price. As security escorted Marcus from the building for the final time, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction from his downfall. What I felt was a profound exhaustion mixed with relief, like a soldier finally able to rest after a long and brutal campaign. The war was over, but the casualties were still being counted. The weeks that followed Marcus's termination were like watching a company slowly heal from a systemic infection. Employees who had been walking on eggshells began to relax. Productivity improved as people stopped wasting energy on political survival. and the toxic atmosphere that had poisoned daily operations began to dissipate. Harrison called me into his office on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after his son's inglorious exit. The space felt different somehow, lighter, as if the weight of family disappointment had finally been lifted from the mahogany furniture and leather-bound books. "Valentina," he began, settling behind his desk with a folder that looked significantly more substantial than a typical personnel file. "I've spent considerable time thinking about the future of this company, about the kind of leadership we need to not just survive but thrive in an increasingly competitive market." I remained silent, sensing that this conversation would reshape everything that came after. "You've demonstrated more genuine leadership in the past 2 months than most executives show in entire careers," he continued, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of corporate behavior. "You protected our most important client relationship under circumstances that would have broken lesser professionals. You maintained your integrity while under systematic attack. You documented problems instead of just complaining about them. Most importantly, you put the company's interests above personal revenge." He slid the folder across his desk with the deliberate ceremony of someone transferring significant responsibility. Inside was a promotion letter that made my breath catch in my throat. Director of Client Strategy, an executive-level position that reported directly to the CEO and carried authority over the entire client services division. "I didn't ask for this," I said, the words coming out softer than I'd intended. "I know," Harrison replied with something that might have been a smile. "That's exactly why you deserve it. The best leaders are usually the ones who don't seek power for its own sake, but who understand that authority is a tool for building something worthwhile." The promotion came with resources I'd only dreamed of: a substantial budget for expanding client services, authority to hire and structure my own team, and most importantly, the explicit backing of the CEO in implementing changes that had been needed for years. But more than the title or the resources, what mattered was the trust it represented. Harrison Blackwood was betting his company's future on my vision of what professional excellence could look like when it wasn't constrained by incompetent interference or corporate politics. "If I accept this position," I said, looking him directly in the eye, "I want to rebuild this entire division from the ground up. Not just the processes and procedures, but the culture itself. I want to create an environment where competence is rewarded, where people can do their best work without fear of retaliation, where decisions are made based on merit rather than politics." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," he replied. The transformation that followed was methodical and comprehensive. I began by identifying the talented employees who had been marginalized or pushed aside during Marcus's reign of incompetence. Sarah Chun, a brilliant strategist who had been relegated to administrative work because she'd questioned one of Marcus's decisions. David Park, a relationship-building genius who had been excluded from major negotiations because his quiet competence made Marcus feel threatened. Jennifer Walsh, a data analyst whose insights had been ignored because she wasn't part of the inner circle of sycophants Marcus had surrounded himself with. One by one, I brought these overlooked talents back into positions where they could contribute meaningfully. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Projects that had been stalled for months suddenly moved forward. Client relationships that had been strained began to strengthen, and the entire department's energy shifted from defensive survival to creative problem-solving. But the most important change was cultural. I implemented an anonymous reporting system that allowed employees to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. I established regular team meetings where junior staff could contribute ideas and challenge assumptions. Most importantly, I made it clear that competence and results would be the only criteria for advancement or recognition. The results were spectacular. Within 6 months, our client retention rate had improved by 30%. New business development increased by 40%. Employee satisfaction scores reached levels the company hadn't seen in years. The division that had nearly collapsed under Marcus's toxic leadership became a model for how professional organizations could function when they prioritized excellence over ego. During this period of rebuilding, I often found myself thinking about the younger employees who had witnessed the entire saga. From my humiliating termination to Marcus's eventual downfall to my resurrection as an executive. They would ask me privately how I had maintained my composure, how I had survived the systematic attacks on my reputation, how I had resisted the temptation to retaliate in kind. My answer was always the same. You don't always get to choose the battles you fight, but you do get to decide who you become in the middle of them. The truth was that surviving Marcus's campaign of sabotage had taught me something crucial about leadership. That real authority comes not from the ability to destroy others but from the capacity to build something worthwhile despite the obstacles placed in your path. The executives who resort to harassment and manipulation reveal their own incompetence more clearly than any performance review ever could. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly reports that showed continued improvement across every metric that mattered, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Marcus Blackwood, calling from whatever corner of the corporate world, had been willing to take a chance on his tarnished reputation. "Valentina," he said, and I could hear something in his voice that hadn't been there during his time of power. Humility, or at least its distant cousin. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from." I let the silence stretch, curious about what had prompted him to make this call. "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened," he continued. "About the mistakes I made, the damage I caused. I wanted to call and apologize. For everything. For firing you unjustly, for the harassment campaign, for nearly destroying something my father spent 30 years building." The apology was unexpected, and I found myself genuinely surprised by what sounded like sincere remorse. But apologies, no matter how heartfelt, couldn't undo the months of stress, the systematic attempts to destroy my reputation, or the toxic environment his leadership had created for dozens of employees. "I accept your apology," I said finally, because holding on to anger would have served no constructive purpose. "But I hope you understand that the real damage wasn't to me personally. It was to the culture of the company, to the people who suffered under your leadership, to the trust that has to exist for organizations to function effectively." "I know," he said quietly. "I know I can't undo any of that. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did wrong, and that I'm trying to do better in my current position." After we hung up, I sat in my office, an executive suite with windows overlooking the city where I'd once driven home after being fired, and reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. The view from 30 floors up was spectacular, but what I appreciated most was the metaphorical height it represented. The professional recognition that competence and integrity could triumph over incompetence and malice. The sovereign industries relationship continued to flourish, opening doors to partnerships throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Alastair Reeves had become not just a client but a genuine advocate for our services, recommending Blackwood Industries to other companies in his network based on the level of professionalism and cultural sensitivity we demonstrated. Other major clients began seeking us out specifically because of our reputation for handling complex international negotiations with skill and discretion. The division I now led was generating revenue that exceeded even Harrison's optimistic projections. And our success was attracting talented professionals from competitor companies who wanted to work in an environment where excellence was genuinely valued. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching the employees I'd mentored and supported begin to flourish in their expanded roles. Sarah Chun was promoted to Senior Strategy Director and was developing innovative approaches to client relationship management that were being studied by industry analysts. David Park had become our lead negotiator for Asian markets and had successfully closed deals that our competitors hadn't even been invited to bid on. Jennifer Walsh was heading up our new data analytics division and providing insights that were transforming how we approached business development. The company that had nearly been destroyed by one man's ego and incompetence had been rebuilt into something stronger and more resilient than before. The crisis had forced us to examine every aspect of our operations, to eliminate the weaknesses that had made us vulnerable to internal sabotage, and to create systems that would prevent future leadership failures from causing similar damage. Harrison and I developed a close working relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to professional excellence. He often commented that the crisis with Marcus, despite its immediate pain, had ultimately strengthened the company by forcing it to confront problems that had been festering for years. Sometimes destruction is necessary before you can rebuild something better, he told me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. Marcus nearly destroyed us, but in doing so, he also destroyed the complacency and internal politics that were holding us back from achieving our real potential. The industry recognition that followed was both gratifying and professionally valuable. Trade publications featured articles about our remarkable turnaround and the innovative leadership approaches that had transformed a struggling division into an industry leader. Speaking invitations arrived regularly, asking me to share insights about crisis management, cultural transformation, and building resilient organizations. But the recognition I valued most came from former colleagues who had left the company during Marcus's tenure and were now asking about opportunities to return. They had watched from a distance as the toxic culture was replaced by something healthier and more productive, and they wanted to be part of what we were building. 2 years after my initial firing, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the International Business Leadership Conference, speaking on transforming crisis into opportunity, building resilient organizations through ethical leadership. The irony of discussing ethical leadership as someone who had been fired for supposedly being lazy and incompetent wasn't lost on me. But it also served as a powerful reminder of how completely circumstances could change when competence was given the chance to flourish. In my speech, I talked about the importance of documenting problems rather than just complaining about them, of maintaining professional standards even when others abandon them, and of understanding that real leadership is about building others up rather than tearing them down. But mostly, I talked about the power of persistence, of refusing to let incompetent people define your worth or limit your potential. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just professional courtesy, it was recognition from peers who understood the challenges of maintaining integrity in environments where politics often matters more than performance. Many of the attendees approached me afterward to share their own stories of surviving toxic leadership, of rebuilding after professional setbacks, of finding ways to lead effectively despite organizational dysfunction. Those conversations reinforced something I'd learned during the darkest days of Marcus's sabotage campaign. That professional challenges, no matter how personally devastating they might feel at the time, are rarely unique. The same patterns of incompetent leadership, corporate politics, and ethical failures repeat themselves across industries and organizations. What varies is how individual professionals respond to these challenges. Some people become bitter and cynical, allowing their negative experiences to poison their future relationships and professional development. Others become manipulative themselves, deciding that if the system rewards unethical behavior, they might as well participate in it. But the most successful professionals, the ones who build lasting careers and create positive change, are those who maintain their standards regardless of the behavior of those around them. As I stood on the stage that night, looking out at an audience of executives and business leaders from around the world, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. The morning when Marcus Blackwood fired me for being lazy and incompetent felt like it belonged to someone else's life, so completely had circumstances changed. But I also remembered the lessons that crisis had taught me, about the importance of documentation, about the power of maintaining dignity under pressure, about the difference between temporary setbacks and permanent defeats. Those lessons had served me well not just in surviving Marcus's attacks, but in building something positive from the wreckage of what could have been a career-ending disaster. The company I now helped lead was stronger, more ethical, and more successful than it had ever been. The employees who worked there were more engaged, more productive, and more loyal because they operated in an environment where competence was rewarded and politics were minimized. The clients we served received better results, because our focus was on delivering value rather than protecting egos. Most importantly, the culture we had built was sustainable because it was based on principles rather than personalities. Future leadership transitions wouldn't create the same kind of chaos that Marcus's arrival had caused, because systems were now in place to prevent incompetent or unethical behavior from taking root. Standing in my corner office as the sun set over the city, I often reflected on how different things might have been if I had responded to Marcus's initial firing with anger instead of strategic patience, with personal attacks instead of professional documentation, with emotional retaliation instead of ethical persistence. The temptation to respond in kind to his harassment and sabotage had been enormous. There were moments when I wanted nothing more than to destroy his reputation the way he was trying to destroy mine, to use my knowledge of his incompetence as a weapon against him, to fight dirty because that seemed to be the only language he understood. But choosing the higher path, maintaining my professional standards even when he abandoned his, had ultimately been the key to not just surviving his attacks, but transforming them into opportunities for growth and advancement. The documentation I had maintained became the evidence that exposed his corruption. The dignity I had preserved became the foundation for rebuilding trust with colleagues and clients. The competence I had continued to demonstrate despite his interference became the basis for greater responsibility and recognition. The story of my firing, survival, and eventual promotion had become something of a legend within the company and the broader industry. New employees were told about it as an example of how to handle professional adversity with grace and strategic intelligence. Business school case studies analyzed the crisis and recovery as an example of organizational resilience and ethical leadership. But for me, the real significance wasn't in the external recognition or the professional advancement it had brought. The real victory was in proving to myself that competence and integrity could triumph over incompetence and malice, that building something positive was ultimately more powerful than tearing something down, that choosing to be part of the solution rather than contributing to the problem was always the right decision, regardless of the short-term costs. As I packed up my briefcase that evening, preparing to go home to a life that was infinitely more satisfying than the one I'd had during Marcus's reign of corporate terror, I smiled at the memory of that bitter morning by the coffee machine, when everything had seemed to be ending. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, not just personally, but professionally, ethically, and with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've built something worthwhile despite every obstacle placed in your path. The city lights stretched out below my office windows like a constellation of possibilities, each one representing someone else who was fighting their own battles against incompetence, politics, and professional injustice. Some would win, some would lose, but all would have the opportunity to choose who they became in the process. That choice, more than any title, salary, or recognition, was the real prize. And it was one that no Marcus Blackwood, no matter how powerful or vindictive, could ever take away.